All right, it is officially 6:03. Thank you everyone for joining us. A couple of housekeeping things. The first thing is Rebecca, my other co-host, silent partner, mentioned we do have a Q&A section. We will not have the chat available during this conversation, but there is a Q&A. If you hover over the middle of your screen, if you're on a computer, there is Q&A in the center. You can click on that, send your question in, and we'll be able to see that and answer that for you. Some other housekeeping things, we do have closed caption. There's another button in that middle section of the screen. If you hover over it, it says closed caption. Click on that and you will also be able to see as we chat. This conversation, again, is starting right now at 6:03. We will have about a 45-minute Q&A that will go, me as the host, with our guest panelists, and then we'll have an open Q&A session at the end for about 15 minutes. We want to give this conversation the space it deserves and truly needs. So if it goes over a few more minutes, I hope you're okay. I have not introduced myself. My name is Lina Permut. I'm the Associate Director of Individual Giving for Bread for the City. My pronouns are she and her. And welcome to Breaking Bread, a conversation series by Bread for the City. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. Breaking bread is something that I think all of us should be familiar with. At the dinner table, you're having conversation, you're breaking bread across the table and having open dialogue. That's what we're trying to have here and what we'll continue to have throughout this year. We'll continue to share conversations about topics that Bread for the City feels is really a big part of our work and connects us to the community and engages our folks and our wider community in the work that we do in a meaningful way. So I want to introduce our audience, or our panelists, excuse me, and I'm going to start with Rob Henry.
Hi, everyone, and really excited and honored that you considered CASE as a presenter today. Rob Henry, VP for Education at CASE. I oversee our global education programs, including the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for us, we've added belonging to that. Also, our talent management work, the CASE Library. I always say that's my kind of public bio. My private bio, and I promise to be quick on this, is I grew up as a foster kid in a small little town in Tennessee. My mom was illiterate and my dad was a janitor, which I never knew until he retired. So I often say that to people because these conversations and the role of education to me is critical because my parents knew the power of not having it versus having it. And so that's why, for me, I'm in this space and why I'm excited about being here for this conversation today.
Thank you, Rob. Autumn.
Hi, Autumn Hunter. I am public policy legal at Bank of America. In true lawyer fashion, I will say I'm here in my individual capacity and my comments and thoughts are my own. I am also co-chair of our Diversity Inclusion Business Council for the bank, and I sit on the board of Bread Inc. So I'm very pleased to be here. And like Rob, I also come from a working class family. I was the first generation to go to college, let alone to law school. And so it's really been wonderful being able to serve in this way and serving the community in this way. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Brigid?
Hi, I'm Bridget Slipka. I'm the Director of Philanthropy for the ACLU of the District of Columbia. I've been in this role, which is the head of fundraising, essentially for about 7 years, and previously have served as a fundraiser for the Smithsonian and for a couple other of universities. And I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Natalie?
Hello, my name is Natalie Randolph. I'm the Director of Equity, Justice, and Community at the Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C. I'm also a board member of Bread for the City as well, a new board member, so I'm new to the organization. And I've been a lifelong educator. I started in public education in DC public schools in 2005, and before that, as an outreach educator for Department of Public Works. So education is also very, very important to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those introductions. So Bread for the City typically reads its values and sets a tone for any meeting. So I am going to read a statement just to get us all thinking about this topic and to understand the tone that we are trying to set for this conversation. Bread for the City has been staked in the community for nearly 50 years and spearheading conversations both internally and externally for over 10 years about racial justice, so much so that we've added words like justice and dignity to our tagline. What we were doing a year ago, what everyone was doing a year ago, is very different from how we look at the world now. All of us here today, everyone who showed up today, is committed to think and revolutionize racial justice and equity, leaning into the call for action. We want our co-conspirators and allies to move forward to help organizations like Bread for the City to have more Black donors. And we want our Black donors to know that we're thinking of them and that we are intentionally creating a direct line of communication. Black humanity and anti-racist work matters. So, as I said, we hope to be complete within an hour, but that was also a mouthful. This is a safe space for all who have decided to attend today, and we welcome you to show up as you are. So our very first question, I am going to toss it to all of our panelists, so feel free to jump in. We are having this conversation from different perspectives. We've got a director in development, we've got a organizational leader, we've got board members and corporate folks on the call. Why are we having this conversation today?
I guess I can jump in. I think it's important, to reach out specifically to Black and Brown folks in the nonprofit space when our primary service area is Black and Brown people. And so I think that, it's really important to, for our clients and for our donors to see that the leadership and the folks supporting the organization are aligned and look like the folks that we serve. And so that it's not such a downward looking, these people over here are coming to help these people over here, but we're all standing together. And that's just one way just to make sure that our donor space looks like the client space.
I read an article in the Washington Post a few months ago that said African Americans contribute the highest percentage of their income to philanthropy, but no one tends to give recognition to that fact. And I think this is a way to give the recognition and to give power to the African American, the community and the broader community of color for the work that we're doing both in terms of our financial contributions, but also in terms of our non-financial contributions through, the sweat equity that we're putting into the organizations in our community. You're muted, Rob.
I'm muted, sorry, I can go next. I think part of this, and I always get myself in trouble in these kind of conversations because I think we need to be pretty candid, right? I think we're having this conversation because we all know we're just not doing this well. And when I say this, I'm not talking about Bread for the City, but I in higher ed, we're really struggling in this area. We're really struggling in this area. We're so steep in this idea of capital campaigns where you're trying to raise billions of dollars. And so in your head, you have to ask people for large gifts. And we believe that the people who can give are white men. Now, first of all, every data point will tell you that people who give the most are white women, right, in terms of large gifts. So, but there's still those assumptions. And I think to Alm's point is exactly right. We know that people of diverse backgrounds give. Now, where they give is often a different conversation. And I say in higher ed, don't get frustrated that they're not giving to you because you're not engaging them, right? But it's a myth to think that people of diverse backgrounds don't give. So to me, that's why we're having this conversation today.
I think these are all amazing points. The only thing I would add from the perspective that I'm seeing is that in many nonprofits, these high net worth donors often have an outsized role when it comes to decision making. And so if those are a disproportionately white population, we are disproportionately valuing white stakeholders. And so we need, as we try to dismantle that, we have to really look at the role that fundraising plays in our decision-making structures too.
Absolutely. I think as we continue to sort of revolutionize the idea of community-centered fundraising and throw sort of the donor-centric idea to the backseat, we'll get there and continue to grow that idea. So thank you guys for sharing your ideas. Bridget, I want to ask you specifically, since you work in fundraising as a development professional, philanthropy has historically been staked in the more dollars you have, the more attention an organization will pay to you and spend with you. So a combination of that donor-centric fundraising and often white folks showing up with the most dollars has a lot of system to exist that we are hoping to get away from. How have we ended up here in the first place? So
that's a great question, because how can we know how to dismantle it if we don't know how we got where we are? And to your point, right, nonprofits want to be doing the most good as possible. And the constraint on that is almost always a financial one, right? And so we have been pushed to raise as many revenues as we can in order to be able to do the most good possible. And nonprofits are like any business and often fall into the 80-20 model, the Pareto principle, which is that 80% of the wealth may reside within 20% of the stakeholders, or 80% of the revenues come from 20% of the donors. And I have seen this at every nonprofit that I have worked for. And so nonprofits really themselves have a constraint on time and have thought, how can we best be utilizing our time in order to raise the most revenues? And in order to do that, they really end up focusing on that minority segment of donors that give the most funding. We call those major donors. You called it a donor-centric model. This is what institutions have been implementing for the past few decades, is really focusing on this top tier of high net worth, high level donors. At the same time, though, in America especially, we have this vast wealth gap. Last year, the Brookings Institute did a nationwide survey and said that for every dollar that a white family has in assets, a Black family has 10 cents. And in DC, it's worse. In DC, for every dollar that a white family has, a Latino family has 5 cents, and a Black family has like 1.5 cents. It's just appalling, this racially discriminate wealth gap. And so what we have found is now when we look at these major donor programs, we are really emphasizing and centering a group that is disproportionately white compared to all of the stakeholders within our community. So those two things together have meant that as we have valued our largest donors, we have ended up overvaluing white perspectives in our nonprofits.
I also think from this concept of intergenerational wealth being passed on, you also have the networks that are passed on, and those networks become exclusive because they tend to be comprised of persons that have a shared affinity. And the African American and other people of color tend to not share that affinity, short of attending Ivy League schools or happening to be in the same country club. But that happens less often than not. So I think to Brigid's question, we have, how do we get ourselves out of that? I think we know how we got here, but what comes next to get ourselves out of that?
And I would share in higher education, I think your point is great. The 80-20 is definitely in effect. If you look at universities and in capital campaigns, that number now is 90-10, if not 95-5. My concern is not only are we identifying these major donors kind of as their own cohort, right? But we're building relationships around these major donors. And the voices that we're listening to are these major donors. And to me, that's what concerns me about where we are today.
And I would also add, it kind of has a snowball effect, right? You have the major donors that become who you speak to, and they become who you cater to, and they become who you put effort to in your media and your outreach. And so that media and outreach is not really speaking to anyone else but them. So then you don't get other folks to even really see what you're talking about, to see if they might be interested. And it kind of just snowballs down the hill, to where folks that have a stake in an organization that's serving, people either like them or people near to them, they're not hearing much from that organization at all. And so I think we have to pay attention to that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think those were all excellent answers. I guess rolling into, the second part of that question is, so how do we make the changes? How do we get past where we started and move forward? Or Bridget, how has your organization started to do the work?
So there, I can give one quick tactical answer, and then there's a bigger strategic question. The quick tactical one is, many nonprofits release donor roles, which put top and center. Here are our biggest donors, and then here are our second biggest donors, and here are our third biggest donors. The ACLU is actually doing away with that practice, and instead using those communications to center our client stories and center other stakeholders. I mentioned this at the beginning, but I think the bigger challenge is how to separate donors from decision makers. And so, when I talk to a lot of other fundraisers and nonprofits, often there is, as an example, a give-get policy to a board. And I was just talking to a voting rights organization that has a very high give-get policy for their board. And I was trying to explain to them, that means you will only be surrounded by high net worth people who just may not have the same understanding of voting rights on the ground as someone else who has been disenfranchised, right? So if we are allowing, it's difficult. And again, it's been many decades of history of nonprofit governance have been that boards have been often dominated by donors, but decoupling those things may be a step to consider as well.
And one thing I would share with that I think institutions are, and understand I'm coming from a higher ed kind of perspective on this as a nonprofit, is how do we find our potential donors? One of the systems that we've used for decades is zip codes. Is that we do searches by zip codes. And if you're in the right zip code, then you're the one we probably should search for and have conversations with. Well, we know that's just racist from the beginning. I joke with people, if I'm a donor and have created a couple of scholarships, but if you looked at my address, I used to live in Southeast DC. You would never have a conversation with me. So I think that's one of those things that we have to think differently in terms of our process as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that the defining of roles and defining major donors, the definitions that we have used for so long are staked in institutional values that we're trying to move away from. So I think if we broaden our understanding of what it means to be a major donor, and Autumn, you mentioned something before about sweat equity and folks showing up to do the work and provide services and be there is also just as valuable, but oftentimes undervalued and not seen as a major role or a major contributor to the work. So I think nonprofits like Bread for the City are learning to redefine what it means to be a major contributor to our work. So really excited about where we're all moving. So I actually wanted to roll into a next question, and this one is for both of our board members, Natalie and Autumn, and really in reference to the experience of being a donor of color, being a Black donor. What has been your experience, both good and bad, where an organization has really gotten it right with you and engaged you, and also when an organization hasn't gotten it right and hasn't engaged you in a really great way?
Yeah, I was just thinking as Rob and Brigid were talking that relationship building is really key from my perspective. And I thought about when I applied to law school, I applied to Howard and I applied to another school, and I had put my down payment in at Howard University School of Law. And then I got my acceptance from the other school, and I called Howard and I said, I know you have a policy that I can't get this back, but if I want to go to the other school, would you consider giving me my deposit back? And the dean of the law school stayed on the phone with me for an hour and talked me through the reasons why I was considering the other school and the reasons why I didn't need those credentials to get what I wanted to reach my goals. And I thought, if she spent an hour with me getting to know, me, my background, what I was looking for, then that must count for something. And I decided to go to Howard, after visiting. A month later, I got a letter in the mail from the other school that said, don't forget your second tuition deposit is due. And I realized they didn't even realize I didn't make my first tuition deposit. So it became really evident that it was the difference between joining a family at Howard versus becoming a number at the other institution. And I think that is also how I approach donors. I will gladly give my funds to causes and people, friends that are raising money, but where I give most generously are in those spaces where I have developed the relationships, where I have volunteered, where I've had meaningful conversations with, board members or staff. And with Bread for the City, I actually volunteered in their legal clinics when I was in law school. So, being able to join the board was coming full circle, but I think all of that, feeds into my personality, that to me, taking the time and effort to make that connection is really critical for me. And I think that's critical in general for people of color. When we're talking about where they're giving their donation funds, it tends to be, their universities or their HBCUs or their churches, those places that they feel an affinity with. So I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think that relationship piece is critical.
Yeah, I would second that. I think, that kind of goes back to the tendency to focus on those high dollar donors, whereas the time that organizations are spending with that relationship piece, they're allocating most of that time to those big money donors, and they're not taking that personal time. Whereas, there's an organization that I was part of in school, and the only time I'm asked for money is in the mail, right? And I'm never really engaged personally. They probably know I'm not a high, power donor. I was a teacher at the time, but, so I never really gave. Like, I'm just getting these pamphlets in the mail and it's not really personal. And, but who knows, maybe the $1,000 that I had set aside for charity for that year, maybe I would have given it to this organization, but when all I'm getting is paper stuff, and those are the kind of things where we might miss the boat when we're spending so much relationship capital on that 10% and just kind of mass communication on the other 90%. I think you miss some of those conversations. And I think the other thing is, as a supporter of organizations, making sure that the mission and how the organization is going about doing things really resonates and makes sense to the folks that you want it to make sense to. I've been a part of organizations where it's like, maybe you're doing too much. There's, and this is smaller organizations, smaller nonprofit spaces where there's a lot to fix, and it's like, oh, we can do a little bit of everything, but okay, maybe if you narrow it down and focus on this one thing, it'll be a lot more efficient. And then kind of the tendency to really stick with the everything and not really focusing in. And so, somebody that wants to give their money, it's like, I don't want to give my money to just checking the box. I want to give my money to an organization that does stuff really well. Even if it's one small thing, it does this one small thing really, really well. And so that's kind of, I guess, any tidbit that I would give to smaller organizations is pick a thing and do it. There's a lot of things wrong with the world and you can't save everything. But you're going to be more likely to get people to put their money because they know that money is being used and it's taking an effect somewhere. And it's not just being spread too thin. So therefore, the overall effect is like, we had a thing, we had an event, and that's kind of it.
Rob, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything from a donor perspective. I know you've shared before.
Yeah, first of all, I think the comments are great. And Autumn, I think that example you gave is just chilling in terms of what we do at our institutions. For me, I think the part that's frustrating at times is when people don't listen to you as a donor. You make a gift to the Multicultural Center, and now someone talks to you because they want you to make a gift to something else. That's not even part of your mission. You make a second gift to that same part of the institution or part of the organization. And then now someone does a follow-up call, right? And I think that's the part that's frustrating, is sometimes we also don't listen to what's important to the donor versus what's important to us as an organization or as an institution.
Thanks for that. You're right. I think we are working on making sure that we're listening to donors, and I appreciated Natalie's response as well. I think it is important for us to be able to focus our mission and really be able to parse out and speak well about what we do well. So thank you for that. Rob, you've actually taken on a new role with your organization. I wanted to go into that a little bit here about like the evolutionary process of getting into that role, why it was important, and what you're actually hoping to accomplish.
Sure. Of course, I forget to take myself off from mute. I think a couple of things. So starting July 1st, I will become the VP for, and I always have to get the title right, for Development, Culture, and Talent. Case over COVID probably lost over 40% of our revenue. Most of our work is face-to-face conferences, and the area that I was overseeing, we generated about 53% of the revenue for the organization. And so it really gave us an opportunity to come back as a senior team and really think about what are the priorities for the organization moving forward. And I'm excited to say that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and again, as I said, I've added belonging to that, was important for us. So we're really thinking about this work in three areas. I argue that CASE has done good work in the space of diversity and inclusion. But we haven't spent as much time really thinking about equity and justice, and what are the things we're doing as a profession that's keeping women, and I say women as well as women of color, from leadership positions. My stat I often say is our profession is 70% female. But if you look at women in leadership roles, it's about 45%. If you look at people of color in leadership roles, it's about 1%, right? So what is it that we're doing? I think someone said that. What is it that we're doing, and how are we naming this so we then hopefully can dismantle it? We're really working in three different boxes, and I won't spend too much time on this. The first box is really looking at training, whether that's doing individual trainings, looking at diversity audits. Something else we're going to be doing, over the last year, a lot of institutions and organizations have been intentional in hiring more people of diverse backgrounds, or let's be real, people of color, right, in leadership roles. But what they're not doing is providing them the support, and I argue often providing their supervisors the support in understanding that what it means to work with Rob as a Black man. And so one of the things we're looking at creating is a program that looks at an executive advisory program. So then I have a person that I can talk to who is a person of color, who can talk with me when I have kind of these conversations about microaggressions, or guess what was said to me today, right? That can kind of be almost my coach, if you will, through that experience. The second part of our work is really working with minority serving institutions and minority serving community colleges. And when I say that, I always say it's important to understand HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, as well as tribal colleges, to me are different even in that MSI group, right? Because our work is based on our mission. Whereas some of the, Hispanic serving institutions, that work is more of, what percent of Hispanic students do you have at your institution? What percent of Asian American students do you have at your institution? But again, doing more work in that space and providing more resources for those groups. I say to people, one day I was driving, I was listening to NPR News, and our president at that time, President Trump, had made the comment, was it unconstitutional to support historically Black colleges and universities? And from an advancement perspective, I thought, boy, if we did that, what would be the impact on these institutions that I argue, as someone, my sister went to, my sisters both went to HBCUs, a small school in Tennessee, Lane College, that would be critical to the impact that we're having for our professionals in the world today. And so that's why for us, it was important that we renew our commitment to MSIs. And then the last part is really working on search. Again, often my colleagues will say to me, we're committed to DEIB, we just can't find candidates. So that's a pause. And so my response is, so let's find the individuals, right? Whether that's from sales, student affairs, all those different areas. Let's work with those individuals. Let's coach. Let's do assessment. Let's do training for them, so then they can hopefully then consider transitioning or considering a career in this profession. And I could go on a couple more days, but I think that's probably enough.
Thank you, Rob. No, we were just really excited about learning more about your role and learning about what you'll be working on, and excited that organizations are really taking a look at how leadership and how roles can really help create an environment that is inclusive and promotes diversity. So excited to hear more when you get started, and congratulations. So we're actually ready to move into our Q&A portion of the evening. It is 6:35, so we're a little bit earlier, but we actually have quite a few questions that have come through. So these are open questions. So anyone on the panel is open to answer, jump in, say what you'd like. I'm going to start at the top and we'll work our way down this list. What is an anchoring idea of making sure my philanthropy is anti-racist, and what should I do next?
I would just say that I think representation matters. And that would be in your staffing, on your board of directors, in every facet that you are accounting for a diversity of thought and diversity of backgrounds and experiences, which means that we have a lot of work to do to increase representation by people of color on boards. One thing that I absolutely love about Bread for the City is that you have community members that sit on the board. And that is something that you do not see in many places. And it is a way that gives humanity and appreciates and recognizes the community that we're serving as being a valuable contributor to the functioning of the organization.
I would also, I kind of forgot to share my story of how I came to Bread for the City. I think if this is a question about individual, how does my individual philanthropy, is it anti-racist? So I am on the board because someone else, a donor, who could have been on the board decided to contribute their portion so that I could sit on the board and asked me to sit on the board in their stead. So, so they're giving that money, that give-get, but they're asking me in my body and with my perspective to sit on the board. So that's kind of a cool way, to ensure that there's another voice there, that, you're still giving the dollars, but you're empowering a different voice. So that's just one method.
That's wonderful.
I want to jump on something Autumn mentioned earlier about the intergenerational transfer of wealth, because there are two examples I'm thinking of white donors who sort of did an analysis of their own wealth and their own giving. And one person recognized that they had a stock portfolio that had been inherited by a grandparent, and their grandparent was able to invest because they belonged to a union that was only available to white men. And then there was another donor who inherited the estate of his parents, and his parents had built their wealth from a home that had been the beneficiary of racist redlining practices, right? And so both of those donors thought, aha, right, here has been this intergenerational transfer of wealth, and I'm in a position now where I can be thoughtful about how I can now extend that in a way. And one specific tactic that I might suggest to your donors is to think beyond giving just cash, giving a gift of stock, or making a bequest in your will is a way that you can sometimes tap into some of those assets, especially inherited assets, that could really deeply benefit communities of color and go beyond just what might be in your checking account.
And if I could add, I'm so sorry. Well, Rob, you want to go?
No, go ahead, Natalie. Go ahead.
I just noticed something in the Q&A chat, and what Brigid just said about that intergenerational wealth. And if you trace it back, that comes out of our country's discriminatory and racist past. And so there is a question comment about, the fact that white philanthropy might have grown out of white supremacy, and how does that push white donors away? And I think that example kind of shows, like, go back far enough, that ability to be a philanthropist was born out of white supremacy, not individual white supremacy, not to say that any particular donor is themselves a white supremacist or has white supremacist tendencies. It's not the point, but the ability to give that much, the ability to be that high level donor, it did not happen, right away. That's a generational thing, and that's what it's talking about. So hopefully that doesn't, push people away. And if it does, I would challenge people to maybe do some research and try to look inward and think about where is that wealth really coming from, and why does that push me away? Why does that make me feel like I shouldn't be involved?
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, we're looking at the questions, and actually, I want to jump into that one because I do think that there's more there for folks to share about their opinion. I'm going to read an attendee question. So it was suggested that white philanthropy grew out of white supremacy and that white donors tend to have messiah complexes. Can that push white donors away from donating to organization by having that, or by saying that out loud, by, I don't know, sort of forcing this idea, or feeling like we're forcing an idea of white supremacy or saviorism on folks, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's happened to me. And I have difficult conversations with donors all the time. And I feel like this space especially, is one where we can be open to hard conversations, and we can listen to thoughts, and then at least for myself as a white person, I can say, all right, now how can I model what a good donor should be like?
Yeah. I agree. I think that that is the place that of reckoning that we're hoping to come to, that folks don't necessarily see the ability to be a white supremacist in themselves, or that the way that they have given could have white supremacy tendencies, but the opportunity to reflect and to change and to give in a different way, to give in a way that values both our clients, the community that we serve, the community that you're actually a part of, because we're all a part of this community, and to not sort of separate yourself from the work, that your dollar or your philanthropy goes beyond the dollar because you are part of the work in the community.
I know I'm not asking the questions here, but I wanted to ask Brigid, if you mentioned doing away with the donor roles, and I wonder if you've had pushback from some of your high wealth donors, learning that their names will not be featured tied to the high amounts that they're giving.
So we just decided this in April. And it's interesting, Lina mentioned community-centric fundraising, which is there's a great new a peer group that has sprung up, and it's only a year old. I feel like in some ways, these are tactics we are testing right in the moment. I have got, I have more generally brought up do we see white supremacy in philanthropy, and gotten a lot of, don't even bring that up. And it's a process. It's being open to a lot of conversations, and it's at least for myself, continuing to educate and continuing to sort of bear some of that education of other people so that others don't have to do that.
Yeah, I guess a comment I would make is that it is, we know it is, let's be honest, right? But part of the conversation to me is saying, we know it's based in white supremacy, but let me be clear, I'm not saying you are a white supremacist. I think that's the challenge, right? When we use that term, I immediately think Rob is talking about me. And so some of that is how we have that conversation. And I think, honestly, we probably need to do more coaching in that space. My concern is that we're highlighting, and I love this idea of not doing the honor roll or the donor roll, right? But often what we do is we highlight the people who are giving the most to the organizations. And when I look at often many of our magazines, we have those stories, right? But the stories then about the people of color are the ones who receive scholarships, are the ones who are in need, are the stories about the person living in their car, right? So we're sometimes even reinforcing these theories that it's the white donor that is, to some degree, the savior, the one who can support us, and they're doing it because the Black kids are the ones who need that support.
And I would also add to the idea that the discomfort with the fact that white supremacy and intergenerational wealth has kind of positioned some in a position to be a major donor, and the pushing away that idea and the discomfort with it. But these organizations, both ACLU and Bread for the City, these are organizations that exist because of the history of white supremacy in this country, where there's a situation where we have, a group of people that need assistance or need help because of those things. And so, to try to separate that in any way for one, but not the other, it's not going to jibe. So I think, and these are messy conversations. They're difficult conversations. So I would say to any donor, white, Black, or otherwise, this is messy business. What got us here is messy, and what's going to get us out of here is messy. And that's okay. And that's all right. And I would encourage people, if you feel like this is pushing you away, I'm very sorry. And that's a sign that we've got to do more talking. We've got to engage in more mess, because this is real, and it wouldn't be real. I mean, and these organizations wouldn't be here if it wasn't. And so if it's that important to you to give that much money to an organization like this, then it should also be important to you to figure some of that out and explore some of that. And folks are here to help. It's not like anybody's no organization is going to put that white donor on their magazine and say this white donor is born out of white supremacy. That nobody's here to drag anybody through the mud. But it is a conversation that kind of needs to be had because this is the work that we do.
May I give a different example and kind of flip this around a little bit? And I know I think I'm talking too much, so then I'll step back. When I was at the Smithsonian, I happened to be there when they were raising funds for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And one of the most meaningful gifts they got was $61 from a group of kindergarten students who all went to their piggy banks, right, and did chores for their parents and collected their nickels and dimes and then made that gift. That would be a phenomenal gift to highlight in your annual report instead of your major donors, right? So let's think about who are the donors who are where the gift to them is deeply meaningful and is deeply meaningful to the organization, right? And that I think really gets to the community part of community-centric instead of just donor-centric.
I actually also would like to add that this work or this relationship is a two-way street. And so how the development staff, how we talk about those who are receiving services from us, I think is also very important. Promoting excellence, promoting joy, talking about the joy of being Black and in our community, the historical and giving pride and dignity to our community members, and not focusing on the poverty piece of it in talking about the work, I think is another way in which organizations are really trying to pull back from this, you are saving someone from their lives. And that's because that's not the work. You're being a good neighbor, you're being a good community member, you are supporting the folks that live near you. So, all right, more questions. So, all right. We've got so many here. I'm trying to read through them. So what should I be looking out for in a nonprofit that is authentically doing anti-racist work? What are some good signs?
I think one is like how Brett, has clients on the board. I think giving whoever is the recipient of whatever service a real voice and a real seat at the table is key. If the folks that are served don't have a seat at the table, that's a bad sign.
So I did a volunteer activity a few months ago for a nonprofit that works to close the education gap through summer school. It's here in the DC office. And we were talking about the pipeline to practice and our backgrounds. And after we got done with the volunteer activity, I received a message from the person that was running it that asked me if we could have a follow-up, and he invited me to sit on their advisory board. And the reason he wanted me on the advisory board is because they had their board of directors that had its, composition, but they had a separate advisory board that were made up of people who had a certain shared background with the clientele they were serving. And we could help shape the way the program went and help guide their decision-making in a way that would best serve the population that they were serving. And I think that is really what we're getting at here. I think we're all contributing because we care about these organizations, and every dollar matters in contributing to the organization. But we're talking about ensuring that there are representative voices for the client base that are helping to drive the decisions and determining the pathway of the organization. And I lost my other train of thought. It was bound to happen.
I would say one thing for me is I look at the leadership of the organization. And is there diversity there? And we know this is a tough spot. I continue to say it's still still will be hard for us to change this work until we have people in leadership roles that can change cultures. I believe that many organizations are committed to this work, but often they're more committed to their cultures that they currently have. And so how do we start to shift the cultures?
And I'd also like to kind of clarify, at least from my perspective, the importance of diverse leadership and diverse staff and, diverse philanthropic staff, all of that. The need for diversity is not in order to just do right by people who haven't been done right by before. It's not just to find somebody to fit in that box. Diverse teams solve complex problems faster than homogeneous teams. And that is why you need diverse leadership. It's not, just because we want to feel good. It's because you have a complex problem to solve. And if you have everybody looking at that problem from the same direction, you won't be able to solve it quickly. So you have to have those diverse perspectives. And diverse perspectives happen to be influenced by your identities, your experiences, your past experiences, and what have you. We can't get away from that. My perspective is going to be different than Bridget's perspective just because I walk through the world in a different body than Brigid does. But that, that's my perspective. And we're going to see the same problem differently. And if we can see both sides at once, we're going to solve it faster. And that's why you need diverse teams. It's not just to check the box or for reparations or whatever. It's because you want to solve the problem and you want to solve it quickly.
That was a really great way to end that question. That was honestly like a really great answer. I have a question to really development professionals. So I'm going to be looking at Rob and both Brigid to answer this. And I think it's kind of complicated. So if you want me to repeat it, I will. How do you desire to listen to major donors and at the same time decide not to listen too much because they're disproportionately white, are not representative of the primary clients of the organization who are Black? One more time. Okay. How do you desire to listen to major donors and at the same time decide not to listen too much because they're disproportionately white and are not representative of the primary clients of the organization who are Black? So I think this question is suggesting, how is this idea to pull back from white donors? Which I don't believe it is. I think it actually is this is a making the table bigger, making the circle wider, as opposed to saying, no, we no longer can talk to you. Mm-hmm. You're no longer welcome to this conversation, but more so that there are more people who are welcomed to the conversation, more people who should be here because they have diverse perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a philanthropy professional, but I mean, I think I just say the same answer from before. It's because if everybody's disproportionately white, you have a disproportionate perspective. So everybody's looking at the elephant from the trunk and nobody's looking at the elephant from the tail, so you need to find somebody who can look at the elephant from the tail.
Yeah, and I think I would say, and Bridget will have a better response than I'm going to have to this, but I think part of it is I would never encourage us not to listen to donors, right? That to me is kind of respectfully as a basic principle of what we've done. And even though I'm at an association now, I've worked at Yale, at Michigan State, and at UConn kind of in these roles. And so I think we have to do that. I really think it goes always back to the mission of the organization. And that to me is the conversation that you want to have with that donor. The donor may say, here's what I'm really interested in. But I often say, it is a relationship, right? So here are our priorities, and here's what we're trying to do for the community. And then just to talk through that, because again, it's not a kind of, we're going to have this conversation and fix it in 15 or 20 minutes. But I just think we should be clear here and say we're never saying not listen to donors. We're never saying, and I think not engaging white donors. I think that would be the wrong message.
I think Natalie said it like beautifully earlier. The only thing I could add, an additional sort of community-centric fundraising principle that is being discussed more and more amongst fundraisers is getting rid of the idea of like transactional gifts, so that usually a donor would give a gift of a certain value and then get a certain amount of access. And again, sort of like trying to dismantle that structure so that you are continuing to listen to donors of that level, but you're listening to donors of all levels. You are not really like having so much of that quid pro quo built into the donor mechanism.
Thank you. I keep not being able to find the mute button, and I'm like, oh, get to it quickly. Okay, so I guess one question that I think would be really great for all of us to answer, but I'd love to hear from Natalie and Autumn especially, is how do you like to be introduced to new organizations? Have white allies or co-conspirators brought you into the fold effectively?
Yeah, I think the story I just shared was an effective way of bringing me into the fold, which was encouraging me to volunteer with an organization. And I think that feeds into my earlier point about a relationship building. So when, excuse me, when nonprofits are coming to corporations and inviting them to collaborate on different initiatives, I think that is opening the door for us to get in there as not just as volunteers, but then to go on to be donors to those organizations and potentially board members. It really comes down to, I talked about networks earlier and having access to networks. That's really how we're getting connected with different organizations, short of receiving mailers in the mail that we, might see and use as a dustpan. You really need to have some kind of tie-in to the organization. And I think people need to see something they feel passionate about, and in order to get really involved or to give more generously. And I think all of this just comes from being involved in a more meaningful way than just simply writing a check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with everything that Autumn said, and also add, people like to know that their opinion is valued, right? We all have opinions about everything. When you say, how do you like to be introduced to organizations? For me, if you just say, I want your perspective, okay, there you go. I think that's an okay thing to say. Like, look, we're this organization. We have this perspective, and this perspective, but we're missing this. So are you able to help us with that? Or do you know anybody that is? I think that's appropriate because that's the truth. And I think that also goes back to that point. Well, the white donors and it's not that we wouldn't listen to them. That is a perspective, an important perspective, and who else is missing? Who is not at the table? And how do we find those voices? How do, Bread has the client voice there. So that's one voice. And to Rob's point, the clients are the ones that are receiving services. Are those the only Black and brown voices that we're hearing from? There are other Black and brown perspectives. Not every Black and brown person is a client or what have you. And so just laying out what perspectives are important, what perspectives are affected by our organization, or what perspectives would have a stake in our organization, and are they here, yes or no? And if it's no, where do we find them? If your staff is not diverse right now, fine. How can you go and seek out that perspective to account for what you're missing? It's a pieces game. What pieces do you have and what pieces do you need?
Awesome. Well, we actually have gotten to 7:02. So I think I am going to end this conversation here. Any final thoughts from our panelists? Anything? Autumn, you came off mute, I think. No?
I stayed off mute. I forgot to mute myself.
No, you're fine.
I will say though that I think this entire breaking bread concept is speaking directly to what I've been saying for much of this conversation, in that there is importance and power in establishing these kind of discussions and relationships, and I think it can be, a really meaningful avenue.
Yeah. So we're actually looking forward to continuing the conversation with both our audience members and with the folks on the panel. We'll be sending out an email to follow up with everyone. It will share some readings and continue some more personal one-to-one conversations with folks who showed up today. There will be a recording of this available in the next couple of days or so. Look out for that. We are so thankful to have had everyone here. We're thankful for the conversation and for the questions that were asked today. Thank you, panelists, for showing up and for giving your perspectives and sharing so much of yourselves today. I really appreciate it. And have a good night, everyone.